So it's been a long day and it's sunny outside and you've all been working really, really hard. And I thought it was really thoughtful of the organisers to put a beautiful buffet and a bunch of glasses of wine outside, so you had to walk past it to get into the room to my lecture. But then I realised this was an experiment in social engineering. It's a metaphor for a PhD, basically. What you've seen out there is what you were promised in the world of academia, but you have to go through the pain of research and writing up. And when you leave, all of that will be gone, replaced by some dried up sandwiches and a bottle of Vimto. Because that's the harsh reality, okay? So don't expect a single sausage roll. They were there to teach you a hard lesson about life in academia. I'll keep this as brief as I can, because actually I'm rather hoping we'll get there before they remove the last glass of wine. And I've called it Working with Archives, because I want to talk to you a bit about how the world has changed as a result of digital technologies, which I know a bit about, what I get up to at the BBC, and to give you a couple of specific examples of ways in which the BBC Archive has been used as a resource for research in the arts and humanities, so you might be inspired. I do work as head of partnership development in the archive, and that means I have a role to try and think about the ways in which we can get the most out of the BBC's extensive archive, or rather how we can use the stuff the BBC forgot to throw away, which is really what the archive is. And if we begin to acknowledge that the BBC is both a cultural institution as well as a broadcaster, just because it's called the British Broadcasting Corporation doesn't mean that's all it has to do, then it becomes very quickly clear that we should allow the materials that the BBC accumulates, whether it creates it itself or just curates it from other people, to be the subject of academic research, and this could be of value. And we do have a tradition of bringing engineers and computer scientists and people like that into the organisation, because the BBC at heart is an engineering institution. Over the last 90 years, the BBC has created two technologies that were remarkably successful. You might have heard of them. They're called radio and television. And so it might well do it again. And that engineering tradition is really important. But we are also a repository of enormous cultural value, and humanities researchers should find interesting things as well. And I want, over the next couple of years, to begin to shift that balance slightly. So I'm very happy to talk to any of you offline about that. So let's get some context. Sometimes in the world, things really do change. Obviously, we all like to think we live in a special time. We like to think we live in a moment of transition, that nothing will ever be the same, that our mere presence on the earth marks a shift in its rotation, and people will look back to the moment we first put pen to paper and say, that was the point that humanity achieved fulfillment. Each of us has that dream, don't deny it. It is rarely true, but sometimes we're lucky enough to live through a once-in-a-civilization transition. Movable type did enormous things to the world. It enabled the creation of forms of learning and knowledge transmission, and we still live in the world it created. The ripples continue. And 70 years or so ago, digital computers started to appear. This is a machine called the EDSAC, which first ran a program in Cambridge in 1949. And EDSAC and its offspring, everything to the smartphones in your pockets, have transformed the world in a way that I think may be more significant than the invention of movable type, that may end up being as significant as the invention of writing in the first place. So this actually is one of those points where the world changes. And I've prepared a graph to show you what sort of impact this will have on you. Now, it may take a little bit of interpretation, just to clarify. The blue bit are the aspects of your life that are going to be changed by the emergence of the internet. Okay. It's significant because things don't go away just because the internet exists, but the environment within which they exist has shifted. The network changes the world even for people who don't use it. If you're in a rural village in India, if you're in some cottage in the Andes, wherever you are, because the global economy now depends on it, because trade now depends on it, because communications now depend on it, because the media now use the network, the space within which you operate has been shifted by the development since 1983 of this technology we call the internet. That doesn't mean we're moving into a digital world, and I don't like the phrase digital age or digital world in any way. Sorry. We remain human beings who get frogs in our throats and have to drink water. We remain people who come into rooms and experience each other in the flesh. We continue to eat and drink. We continue to engage with each other. We can have a philosophical debate later, but I promise you we will never upload our consciousnesses into the machine. It is not going to happen. We may build strong AIs, and they may become our best friends and eventually our rulers, masters, and destroyers, but we... speculation. But we are not going into the machine. These consciousnesses are embodied in the flesh, and that's where they will remain. And these flesh-embodied consciousnesses will be the ones that are human civilization. But the affordances of digital technology, the things digital technology makes possible, can also start to shift our consciousness. So imagine many of you use Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, WhatsApp, other services to stay in touch with people. Some of you may even be doing it now if, unlike me, you can get onto EduRoam at the moment because the authentication server seems to be down. Think about what happens when you do that. Think about the space you occupy. Because until relatively recently, there were basically two spaces. There was a space in your head and there was a space outside your head. And when you were inside your head, maybe reading a novel, you were there on your own. If you were reading a book, you animated the characters. You brought them to life. And you took the words that had been put in a particular order by an author and you added yourself into that mix. But all of the action happened in your head. And then when you're in the physical world, unless you're a solipsist, you assume that that you all have minds, that we're engaging with each other, and we use physical media to talk to each other. But with something like Twitter or Facebook, you have a conversation that's happening in your head and other people are there with you. They are active participants in it. That it's a third space that is unprecedented, that is most closely aligned with the sort of religious experience people might have had when the spirit gods were talking to them. Now, I happen to believe that those gods weren't really there, but as far as I know, most of the people I talk to on Twitter actually are. Only some of them are bots. And we are only just beginning to adapt to what that means for how we construct reality out of the stream of information and data that comes to us every second and every moment. So I think we're on the cusp of having a shift in human consciousness that could be really, really important going forward. And I don't know where it's going to take us. But that's one of the reasons why I do say we are living at a moment of historic importance. And it may not be a digital world, we may remain in the physical world, but it is a world in which these technologies are going to be absolutely central to how we operate. And why the area of digital humanities, for me in particular, is something which really requires careful consideration and thought. How you do research, how you publish research, what it is you research, all those things are now up for grabs. And in the space that is emerging because we now have the internet in it, every institution faces significant challenges. Not just academia, but of course also the BBC itself. The BBC is an odd body. It was created in 1926. It was actually founded in 1922 as the British Broadcasting Company, when a group of radio manufacturers got together to form a cartel because they'd realized that if you wanted to sell radios, people needed to have something to listen to on them. Sort of makes sense. And so they created a broadcaster that would put out radio programs and people would then listen to them and buy radios. And after 4 years, the government of the time realized that this was significant, and so it turned the British Broadcasting Company into the British Broadcasting Corporation. This happened in 1926, 1927. And so the BBC has been going since then, 90 years or so, and it has a mission to inform, educate and entertain. And this person, John Reith, was the very first Director General, and as you can see, a cheerful man, an optimist about the human condition, somebody who really wanted people to explore the fun side of their personality. And he shaped the BBC on the back of this document, which is the 1926 Charter, signed by King George V. I've held this in my hands. It's in the BBC archive. You can play with it. It's on vellum. It's very nice. And it says, and I'm going to quote here from the, it's there, sort of third paragraph down. We deem it desirable that the service should be developed and exploited to the best advantage and in the national interest. Now, what you call the national interest may vary from time to time, but the sense that the BBC is there to serve the public. And the technology he talks about is communications technology. At that time, it was radio. Eventually, it became television. Eventually, it became the internet. But the BBC's core mission is to use the technology of the communications technologies available to serve its purposes. It's not to make radio programs or television programs. It chooses to make programs in order to do that. Now, if that mission is to use the technology in the national interest, I would argue, I have argued, then allowing access to the BBC and the resources it has so they can be used for research purposes is absolutely fundamental and central to that right from the start. It's not something new you have to add in. It's actually being true to the BBC's mission. Because one way you support the national interest is supporting research endeavours, is supporting academic engagement, is allowing people to interpret and analyse what it is you're doing so that it can help you do it better, or point out where you've done it wrongly, or use it for purposes you have not imagined, that the BBC is not the controller of the interpretation of its story. And you can go back to 26, the next time someone tells you, no, the BBC's there to make telly. It's not. Tell them Bill said so. Given that, I found myself 5 years ago as head of partnerships and archive development. How many people have seen The Matrix, the film The Matrix? Okay, some of you will get this. I'm a bit like Neo in The Matrix. I have two lives. Okay? In the evening, I'm a freelance technology journalist with a witty line in banter and some very left-wing political views. In the daytime, I wear a slightly smarter suit than this sometimes, and I'm head of partnership for the BBC, and I am, of course, completely neutral. Okay? At this precise moment, I'm sort of flopping between both of those. So I trust you will all be able to use your judgment to decide how to interpret what I say. I believe in the BBC and its mission, and I think we could do better. And so I took the role in archive development because there was an opportunity to engage with the BBC's archive and to figure out what could be done with it. First time you say to people you work with the BBC archive, they usually ask you if you can get them a program of some sort. Because they have this vision that the archive is like the world's biggest catalogue of videos. It's like, see, 3 years ago I could say it's like Blockbuster, but that doesn't exist anymore. Which is, of course, a good metaphor. But, you know, serried ranks of videotapes, and you just pull out the one you want and watch it, and that would be it. And, of course, it's not like that at all. A, we haven't got all the programs, and B, it's a lot messier, and C, yeah, there's so much more in the archive. So people's view of the archive is almost based on this 1960s model of the nuclear family gathered around the television on a Saturday night watching the entertainment, and that we harken back to that golden age. But the reality is it's much more interesting because the archive has a vast amount of stuff in it. It is the living memory of the BBC. And the BBC as an organisation has documents and letters and scripts and all that sort of stuff. It has PSBs and PSCs, programmes as broadcast, programmes as commissioned, which are just documents that describe the programmes. It has buildings. There's a very iconic BBC building called Television Centre, which was sold 3 years ago. And before the BBC moved out, I persuaded Google to come in with their Street View cameras on a trolley and walk up and down most of the corridors. So if you go to Google Maps now, you can go inside Television Centre as it was before the BBC left on Street View and have a look around. And it's quite an interesting thing to do. So yeah, we archived a building. That's a good idea. I'd like to point out that we also have in the BBC archive the memories of everybody who's ever worked at the BBC, and I reserve the right to stick a straw in their brain and suck whenever I feel I need to. So we have a project with the pensioners, BBC pensioners. They have their own private Wikipedia where they're encouraged to enter their memories of the things they worked on, programmes, technology, stuff like that. And we're just slowly accumulating this, and it's slowly self-correcting to the point where it will become a viable resource that people, researchers can use. So the archive's a lot of stuff. And as stuff, it's also quite a lot of stuff. You know, it's reasonably big. But not that big. Not unassailably big. The BBC has about 600, 700,000 hours of television in its archive. Okay? Last 70 years of TV. YouTube grows by that every week. Okay, so YouTube grows by the size of the BBC's video archive every week. So if anybody in the BBC tells me there are technical issues about accessing the archive, I tell them that that's not the case. Actually, I'm less polite than that. But I'll be respectful to you. I tell them that they may possibly be mistaken. I challenge their inheritance. Because it's not that much. It's interesting stuff, it's quite valuable stuff, but it's not a vast quantity in any reasonable sense for any large archive that's growing at the moment. Archive.org's a lot bigger. So if we chose to, if the BBC chose to, all of this could be digitized. All of this could be made available. It's not because we choose to make Strictly Come Dancing instead. That's fine, you know, it's cool. Yeah, we choose to let, what can I say? We choose to let thousands of people die on the roads every year by letting each one of us take half a ton of metal and drive at 70 miles an hour on urban streets. You know, frankly, as a society, we make poor choices all the time. This, on the scale of that, is, you know, quite a relatively small poor choice. But it does niggle. There was some research done for the European Commission, for Neelie Kroes when she was commissioner, by her Comité des Sages, her bright people. And they estimated that digitizing all of Europe's cultural heritage, the whole, everything in every museum, gallery, library, archive, whatever, would cost about 20, 25 billion euros, or a bank. And I thought, well, that would be so much. I mean, why did we bother bailing out RBS? We could have done that instead. Much better choice. But again, people make the wrong decisions. And yeah, it's part of your role over the next 5 years to do such fantastic research and to publish such stunning theses that will change. And I look to all of you to make it so clear of the value to the world as a whole of exploring these repositories that they will cough up the 20 billion on it or so. It was only 20 billion euros, it wasn't even pounds, you know. Well, that's what, 15, 16 billion pounds. It's a bargain, a real bargain. So we have this stuff, and it's not all digital. In fact, most of it is not digital. The video and the stills and the sound will eventually be digitized just because we're digitizing for preservation. But there is actually no formal digitization process within the BBC. So at the moment, there's no fund that is just used to digitize. If we want to use a program for something else, we'll digitize it. If the tape it's on is beginning to fall apart, we'll digitize it, those sorts of things. But we're not actually going out and digitizing it. And it's actually quite hard to get stuff digitized on demand. Stepping away from being head of archive partnerships now, I heard a tale, can't think where it came from, that at one point for a project, some stuff needed to be digitized and the BBC wouldn't pay for it. And it's very hard for the BBC to take money from anywhere else. And so it was arranged that the tapes that needed to be digitized would be put on a van, which was driven out of the BBC to a digitization factory and then driven back in the next day, along with some hard drives that happened to have digital copies on it, and nobody knows who actually paid for the process, because it would have been too messy to have to account for the fact that some money was spent on digitization. See, that's the sort of absurdity you could probably do without. Get me drunk later and I'll tell you what really happened. We also catalogue the stuff. And cataloguing is obviously really, really important. So I'm just going to, I've got time, jump in, or rather jump out of this. See, there isn't a proper mouse on this machine, so I have to show you my workings, which is a real pain. Since almost the beginning, the BBC has published a weekly magazine called Radio Times, which tells you what's on radio and then on television. And 5 years ago, we started a project to digitize it. So we scanned and then zoned and OCR'd and digitized all of the Radio Times that we could find. And what we've therefore got is a program history of the BBC. So let's go to the 1940s. Okay, pick a year, any year, somebody. 45, thank you. Pick a month, someone. September, okay. And let's see, okay, let's go for 14th September, okay? This is the London edition of the Radio Times from the 14th September. And here we got what's on the Light programme. On the 18th September 1945, we had Keyboard Cavalcade with Vivian Ellis. Rudy Lewis playing the organ of the Gaumont State in Kilburn. An educational broadcast called Job in Hand about industrial building, where George Darling asked Mr. J. Ross Work, manager of a great steel firm, about the steel industry, followed by a record album. Okay, so we launched this about 6 months ago, and everybody instantly just spent looking at their birthday. What was on the day I was born. Yeah. You couldn't hear it. We don't have very much of this stuff at all, but we do at least now know what we don't have, which we never did before. So it's a start. And over the next 6 months, the stuff we do have will be flagged on here. So it will say, we hold a copy of this, and it will say, but you can't see it anyway, because we're like that. And then eventually, people will start sending us in stuff they might have in the attic that we don't have, and so we start adding to the archive. So that's just a demonstration of where a cataloguing project can make a big difference. So if you want to know, okay, does anybody here know, let's see, think of an important date in history, something significant in your research happened. You know, the day Sylvia Plath killed herself. We can find out what was on the Light programme around that time. You know, what was she listening to? What was Beckett listening to in Paris? No, he was in Paris. What was, I don't know, think of something George Orwell listening to when he was writing his diary entries about his chickens up in Hertfordshire. Those sorts of questions. So we can begin to answer those questions. So it's a really lovely resource. It was only fantastically complicated, messy, and horrible to do. But then, good things are, as they say. Okay, so we did that. Cataloguing helps. The point is that by surfacing the archive, we make it clear that the BBC has been remembering stuff for everybody. The Mackintosh Library at Glasgow School of Art was destroyed in a fire last year. You may recall if you care about such things. And you should. And shortly after, literally the week after, I got one of the archive team who works for me to go through the BBC archive and find everything we had, all footage we had of the library and the building. And we put it onto a hard drive and gave it to them. And it included rushes from a programme that had been made 3 months earlier, which had just tracking shots of the library, all the stuff that a gifted camera person will do when they're not having to follow someone who keeps jumping around unexpectedly. To do tracking shots and all the B-roll, basically. And so this is really helpful, because if they want to rebuild the library, they can know which bits of wood were actually rubbed and what was the pattern, and so it will be valuable to them. And I think that was really good. We remembered it for you. Those rushes were going to be deleted the day after I asked for them, because you don't keep rushes. It's not that close. Because why would you? You've made the programme, it's finished. So, there are issues there about the way in which we work that, it could have been a real pain. If I'd asked 24 hours later, they would have been gone to save up hard disk space. So, it matters. And it matters because we remember it for you until it becomes important, until you figure out that that was your uncle or grandfather. And then, when you've done that, you want to know, where was that taken? What else was happening here? Is that Auntie Mabel? All those questions. And so as we begin to digitize and catalogue the archive, if we do it to the highest possible degree, then we can start to answer these questions. Going back is quite hard, because that's just a photograph. Okay? You can figure out roughly where it was. There's a bit of watermark written on the bottom. Where is it? Is it gone? It's in Liverpool, I think. There is a little bit of data, metadata about this, but not much. But modern cameras have GPS in them and clocks. So, in 30, 40 years' time, if anybody wants to see, what was filmed in this place, they'll be able to find it much more easily. But if I want to find what was filmed in Newcastle in 1960, the year I was born, that would be quite tricky at the moment. So there is an ongoing need to improve the quality of cataloguing. And any of you who are into such things, who understand its importance, may find it quite interesting to pick a chunk of archive and offer or suggest to work with it. Because the more chunks we have that are catalogued to the appropriate level of detail, the better the argument for doing it to all of it. Because eventually it has to happen to all of it. There's no real reason why not, apart from human effort. And then we'll be able to figure out who this was, maybe. It's part of a bigger vision that we have for something that we call the digital public space. But It's the recognition that there's a public space around broadcasting, that we occupy the same shared environment when we watch the same television programs, even if it's on Netflix, on series binging. That there are conversations around those programs, they shape a narrative, and participating in that shared narrative is part of being, is one of the things that sustains civic society. And because we want to do that, because we want to support that public space, we want to find ways to extend it online in ways that are valuable. Because so much of the online space is private or privatized or entirely commercial or based around a surveillance business model. And while that's not wrong in itself, the BBC is carved out as being an exception from that, free from commercial and political interest. And so is there a way to define an online space that the BBC could happily inhabit? And could we put the archive in there in ways that would allow it to be accessed, discovered, made use of by people, both for personal use, private study, research, and in other ways. If you wanted a T-shirt with Uncle Ernie's photograph on it, why should we object? It has no commercial value. And indeed, you paid for it to happen by being a license fee payer, so maybe you should get something back. So there's that broader argument within the BBC, sorry, I won't go on to that one yet, about what we might do. So there's a big picture around the archive, and a large set of questions about what the BBC has remembered in common with other cultural institutions. And this question about whether the BBC can fully acknowledge its status as a cultural institution, or whether it just wants to be a broadcaster that happens to have a library of stuff that it uses to make other programs. And so my team and I, small, slightly disturbed, odd bunch of people, have been working to demonstrate the value or the potential value of this for some time. So we built this thing called Paragon, or we had it built for us. And what Paragon does, it takes a number of linked data catalogues from a number of cultural institutions and tries to allow you to navigate between them seamlessly. So it does federated search across catalogues, but crucially, it doesn't require the catalogues to change in any way. So if you think about British Library Catalogue, National Archives, Kew, the British Film Institute, the BBC, they might all have entries related to, say, a particular opera. But each one will use different metadata schemas. They'll use different terms and terminologies. So we try to, using code, a bit of heuristics, a bit of algorithms, a bit of luck, see if we could actually establish identities between items in the different catalogues to a reasonable degree of certainty, so that we could pull together all the references to Covent Garden and distinguish between the place in London and the Opera House. So if you did a search for Covent Garden, we could offer you opera and then take you down that path. And we built this thing called Paragon. It was a proof of concept, and I think it did quite well. And then we populated it with quite a lot of stuff from Wikipedia to put images and pictures in there because we had rights issues with the actual content. But we figured out a way to build it's like cross-catalogue aggregator for linked data that we think works. And we're offering it inside the BBC as a research tool, but also we see it as a model for other cultural institutions to use. Because if you don't have to actually change your cataloguing procedure, but you can allow that sort of cross-catalogue search, it helps a lot. We did an arts project called The Space, and this was 3 years ago now, where we took some money from Arts Council England, which is the funding agency for public arts in England. That's why it's called Arts Council England. And they put in some money to fund 53 commissions for digital projects from arts organisations that hadn't done them very much before. And we at the BBC built a cloud-based video distribution platform, which was radical at the time, and it was, again, demonstrating we could do it. But what we also did was required everyone, as they submitted their project, to fill in quite a long and complicated catalogue entry for it. So we gathered the metadata we wanted in a precise format, because we then wanted to see if we could experiment with user journeys, whether we could do a recommendations engine within the space that was better than anyone else, certainly better than Netflix. How many times have you spent 2 hours on Netflix trying to find something to watch and then fallen asleep? Basically, Netflix cataloguing is, that's the time. So we built this, and it didn't work. But then not everything works, because we just didn't have enough data. There weren't enough entries. We only had 53. Well, we had about 200 items in total when it was all added in, and it wasn't enough to do serious recommendations. So this is one of the things where scale really matters. But it was a lovely little project, I think, and we taught a lot of arts organisations how to do digital commissioning, which mattered. And if somebody wanted to do some proper analysis of what really happened in the space as a less than perfect cultural proposition, we didn't shred anything, we got the data. It would be quite nice to come back to it and revisit it, because the story certainly needs to be told. We then took the space and the stuff we've done with Paragon and have done something called the Research and Education Space, or RES. Rubbish name. We're really bad at names. You'd think we'd be better with the BBC, for Christ's sake. Anyway, we're really bad at names. Research and Education Space, and this is an improved version of the Paragon aggregator that is intended to pull in linked open data catalogues from everywhere for material that is licensed for educational research use, hence Research and Education Space. The name is a sort of bit of a giveaway. And we've done this in collaboration with JISC, who you will all know of, and the British University's Film and Video Council, who, if you don't know of, you should know about. And the idea, again, is to build a platform that other people will use to build tools and services on top of that will make it easier for teaching purposes or for researchers to find relevant material. So if you want to find something about, Orwell, we can tell all the stuff about George Orwell from the various catalogues without you having to visit each one separately. And it's 2 years into a 3-year project and doing quite well. Happy to share more with you. We're also publishing all the source code on GitHub, so it's freely available. So if you want to play with our aggregator, if you're that sort of humanities person, do feel free. I see you do, sir. So we did that. We did this with the BUFEC, which is an interesting project. And I'm going to actually, again, drop out of Keynote and go back to the real world, or the internet, as other people call it. Where is it? Yeah, this is, there's Chronicle. So Chronicle was a project where we digitized 500 hours of news footage from Northern Ireland from the 1960s and 70s. So during the 60s and 70s, within Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, there was enormous sectarian conflict, religious conflict, a lot of violence, and it was a very important historic moment. The BBC in Northern Ireland filmed not just the stuff that was newsworthy nationally, the bombings, the political stuff, but also just ordinary life for the people living there. And a number of researchers were interested in finding a way to get access to news footage that might have been broadcast once 40 years ago, or maybe even not broadcast at all. And so we put together a small project, a modest project, with the British University Film and Video Council, paid for by JISC and the BBC, to digitize about 500 hours, put it up on a server and make it available through a login, so it's behind a authentication layer, for research and teaching purposes. And the deal was, this is uncatalogued stuff, so as you look through it, given you're an academic with an interest in and knowledge of Northern Ireland, please tell us what's in it. Identify the people and the places and the dates, because we have very poor metadata for this. And this has been a fascinating project because people are using it. This is actually a demo, and you can make your own, where's it gone? Yeah, playlists of clips you might want to show your students or that you might be researching. And if you're starting to build, sort of a publication record and you want publications that have embedded video in it, we have access to this. So this is a small collection of material that we think is of interest to academics and academic researchers. Again, it's a proof of concept. We could do this for lots more. We could work with people to define and build collections and then find the money to digitize it, or it might already be digitized, begin to catalog it. This was successful in terms of research use and less successful in terms of our cataloguing, because we were optimistic and believed that if you asked a bunch of academics to tell you what was in something, they'd be precise and accurate and short. And so we left some free text fields in there and people wrote a lot. And it is fascinating stuff, but quite hard for our archivists, the people who are working in BBC archives, to make sense of. So it's been successful. We have a catalogue, but in terms of getting an index of this material that could be used by BBC programme researchers, it has been less successful. And we've learned something from that, which is you need to constrain people if you're asking them to feed back metadata. If you're going to crowdsource cataloguing, you need to let people know the sorts of things you're interested in. You can't just rely on them having an intuitive understanding of what a BBC programme researcher might want to look for in something. You need to educate them about that, and you need to give them a tool that lets them do it well. So it's an incredibly useful project, still live and still quite valuable. And then I'm going to finish by talking about this. Yes, I'm going to show you a video. And then I'll be out your hair and you can go and get the wine. Well, not quite. Hold on. So how many of you read the news today and noticed this? Yeah. Okay, so 1984-85, the miners' strike in the UK, which I lived through. You can possibly speculate as to what my views were about it, so I won't go into that. Today it was announced that there will be no formal investigation into allegations of criminal wrongdoing by police. This was published today. 2 days ago, I was preparing the material for this talk, and I wanted to talk about this, which was a project that the BBC did with the AHRC 5 years ago now with Simon Popple at the University of Leeds, investigating the miners' strike as a case study in how broadcast archives reflected historical events and how they could be used as a tool to explore reminiscence and even reconciliation about those historical events with those involved. So it seems quite timely. And what the Open Archive did was to take the miners' strike as a historical event and hold a number of workshops where miners, the police and other members of the community were brought together, and discussions were based around BBC news footage from the time provided by the archive. And of course, historically, the miners have felt that the BBC misrepresented them because the BBC cameras, by and large, were behind the police lines because it was safer there. And the BBC news footage, they would argue, therefore did not properly put their point of view. So there was some unhappiness with the BBC as a historical record, and there's been continuing conflict within the communities for those on either side of this conflict. And so what Simon and his team did was to bring these people together to explore how both national and regional BBC News reflected the story, to attempt to uncover what people's actual memories were and how they might be supported or refuted by that coverage, and then to draw some larger lessons, both for the BBC's editorial policy, so feeding back into the BBC, really valuable for us, and also for the community about how that material might be used in this context. A really nice example of how you can take some part of what the BBC has remembered for everyone and use it as the basis of a project which doesn't have to be about broadcasting, it doesn't have to be about the thing the BBC is, it can be about any aspect of the arts and humanities. And so what I would like you to consider is the collection that the BBC holds is just as relevant for research purposes as any collection. It's just the BBC presents it in a particular way. This is our broadcast history, this is the broadcast, and does put up barriers to entry. And we, me and my friends, are trying to bring those barriers down, trying to bring people in and make it more available, more accessible. It is not simple and straightforward, but it can be incredibly rewarding. And I'm very happy, to talk to any of you in your studentships or to anybody about what might be done with the BBC material. We're trying to improve the cataloguing and trying to get the BBC material catalogued in the same way as other collections are, so it's easier to discover, and then start to overcome the barriers to entry that might be in the way of actually getting your hands on it. And we're making some progress. So that's all I really wanted to say, but now I'm very happy to take any questions or comments from people or anything like that. And there's a hand up already, that was fast.
A few years ago there was some discussion about the remit of the BBC, and I'm interested when you talk about its remit to educate, entertain and inform according to whatever the technology of the day is. And the conversation and the questions were about the BBC's development of websites that seemed to be in competition with other websites. Mm-hmm. Why, the general feeling at that time was that the BBC was stepping outside of its normal remit and should not be engaged in developing platforms across the internet. Why was that question even raised if it is the case that of course the BBC should be engaged in the technology of the day?
It's a very interesting question, as you say. I feel like Ed Miliband. I'm really glad you asked me that. I have the BBC's public purposes on this piece of stone. So there's a very famous scene in Father Ted where the bishop's coming to visit and Father Jack is completely drunk. And Ted says to him, basically, whatever he says, just say, that would be an ecumenical matter. That would be a political matter. Okay? In the last 10 years, the BBC, the people who run television have seen the internet as a way to get television programs to people. And that's what they care about. It's what they're paid to care about. And I would not criticize them for caring about that. But as a result, they have not thought about the broader context of online delivery of the BBC services. And at times of particular, shall we say, political conflict, it's become easier to say, well, look, we'll just carry on doing telly because we know we can do that, and let's not fight too hard for the other stuff. Okay? It was wrong. Right? It was a bad decision, and we are trying to row it back. Anything more? Remember, wine's outside. Actually, I hear it going.
How is all of this work funded? Do you bid for internal money within the BBC?
Yeah, no. The BBC is like the mafia. You know, if I'm to win, you must fail. There's a limited pot of money. 3.7 billion a year comes in from the license fee. If I want money for my project, you can't have money for your project. So no, we have a budget and a staff, and indeed, even as I speak, at 6 o'clock, they'll finish now, conversations are happening about how this is funded. We are dirt cheap because what we're trying to do is to leverage stuff that's happening anyway. So stuff is being digitized for preservation. We might get the things we think are important for a project on top of the pile, but it will all get done anyway, and that budget came from somewhere else. If we're working with students and studentships, we will find ways to work with the grain of another institution. So we don't spend a lot of money because the things we do add value to stuff the BBC is doing anyway. But we do have to bid for it, yeah.
Do you think that if you worked in a different way, say in more specific partnerships where maybe looking at creating big data sets based on your collections, would
Yeah.
it change the way you approach funding?
Yes, though what would probably happen is where archive developments, once something gets to the point where it's business as usual, we give it away to someone else. So we'd persuade technology that has a budget of 500-600 million a year to take it on as part of the thing they do normally. And then it would be a very small amount of their budget, whereas it would be a lot of ours, and then we could carry on and do something else. So we run Genome at the moment because we haven't yet handed it over, but eventually we will hand it over. We don't want to be running ongoing services because once you've got 4 or 5 of them, that's it. That's your job. So, it is very much, trying to be at the leading edge of what's possible with the archive. And then once it becomes, and that actually is one of the problems, which is we try not to do anything twice. So if we've done a project with someone, we then want another bit of the BBC to take that up as normal practice, and we're going on and do something hard. That's why we fail sometimes, because we want to try and do things that can't be done.
So the way the previously accessed archives has evolved, so you're looking at an online catalogue, finding little material. I'm interested in getting in touch with the archive, knowing what's there. How do I get in there? How do I access it? How do I find out if you have stuff I'm interested in?
At the moment, that is roughly the way it will go. What we are moving towards is the catalogue of the BBC's holdings being available as linked data that can be searched using some of the existing federated search engines. So there is already a catalogue of the BBC's programmes that can be searched inside the British Library. Yeah, so the BL catalogue is there. The BBC catalogue service is there. Eventually, that will be pulled into their Primo service. So if you do a search for something, you will get books, you'll get videos, and you'll get stuff the BBC holds. You might then have to come to us and ask for it, but at least you'll be able to do the search in one place. So that's what we're moving towards. And that's what aggregating linked data allows us to do. So we're absolutely in that world. And then we're working with other organisations like the Copyright Hub to try to improve information about the rights around stuff. But yeah, it's early days. It's 6 o'clock, so we're going to stop now unless anybody's got one very brief question or comment. Thank you for sitting all the way through that.